Now, those of you that know the area where Newgate Street meets Blackett Street in Newcastle city centre probably have no idea what this was once. It used to be the site of England's most intimidating prison. It was a tall, square, 3-storey building, but the cellar was one huge torture and punishment area. Like many prisons of the day, often men and women and young children were placed in the same cells, guaranteeing that the women were gang raped and abused, often the children too. Often manacled and unable to move, they were at the mercy of the other prisoners. And in the late 1700s, Betsy Heron and her 9-year-old daughter Eliza were thrown into the cell, supposed to be overnight, after it was thought that they'd tried to steal a pair of boots. Now, as the cell was full of only men, Betsy, the mother, knew that when they awoke, they would both be in trouble. She searched for a safe place for a little girl, and she found a few stones in the wall had been dug out, and managed to hide her daughter in the gap in between the external wall and the internal wall. So on waking, she was brutally raped by about a dozen prisoners, and mid-assault, a guard came to get her to go and face the magistrate. She screamed that she had to get her daughter too, but was dragged out. The magistrate, after about an hour, set her free, having not enough proof against her. She'd been gang raped for nothing. She returned to the prison to try and get her child, who by this time must have been petrified. She was walled in. She was unable to move. A guard went into the cell, but there was no sign of her at all. He went to the wall where the crumbling stones were said to be, and the gap in the wall was empty. Betsy Heron was driven mad by losing a child. She had herself arrested again, so she could look for herself. She got in there, was gang raped again, yet there was still no sign of her. After a long, provoked, vicious attack, she was sentenced to an asylum, where 3 days later she hanged herself. Some say the prisoners had dragged out the little girl and raped her to death. Others that she'd found a way to get out from in between the walls. Yet it seems the guards knew of the prisoners' attempts to dig their way out from underground and had gone in during the night, blocked up the gap, took out the child, and from there the trail goes cold. Either they simply released her without a mother into the empty night, or they used her for their own ends. This was a time when men were very much in charge, and rape was commonplace, and it was rarely ever prosecuted, unless it was done to someone from the upper classes who had power to make things get done. Now, many of the shops in that area and passers-by often see ghosts, totally unaware that a vicious stinkhole of a prison once stood there. One shop used to hear scratching on the floor all day long, and occasionally they would head down to the cellar that was then being used as a stockroom, and they would find bloody scrawlings on the ceiling, as if something was trying to get out, and breaking and snapping their fingernails in their desperate attempts. A teenage worker called Karen went down there in 2009 and was confronted by a huge black shape that lunged at her, pushed her down onto cardboard boxes, and lay on top of her. She screamed and screamed until her fellow workers raced down to see a huge bruise beginning to appear on her jaw and a dark figure melting into the darkness of the cellar. Strange bangings, strange crashings. She quit that day. Yet it's the spirit of another Newgate prisoner, William Hewitt, that still has repercussions today. Hewitt was 16 stone and a bruiser who ran a street gang in 1804. And finally, and only because he was completely drunk, they were finally able to arrest him. His gang were in a fury, throwing rocks through the windows of magistrates and haranguing those who would prosecute him. Threats to them, their wives, their children. They took it all very seriously, as the Hewitt gang was responsible for illicit booze, bawdy women, protection rackets, and general thievery. So finally, Hewitt woke up. He sobered up after 2 days in Newgate. He made it to the assizes and was charged with over 50 separate crimes. Now, it was obvious that they were about to make an example of him before stamping out the rest of his followers. This case went on more than a day, so Hewitt was put back into the prison, manacled by one hand so that he would behave. The thing is, there were many other vicious men in the cell with him. They were not secured, and they had bones to pick with this beast of a man. At first it was the odd stone thrown, an insult or two, and finally one of the other prisoners, equally big in stature, walked up to him and punched him hard in the face, sending a tooth flying from his mouth. Hewitt cursed his attacker, spitting out blood, and got ready for an uncomfortable night. One guard saw what was going on, and as Hewitt had threatened to kill his wife and children unless he gave him the key to the cell, this guard dug out a long-bladed knife from a drawer and threw it into the cell at the feet of Hewitt's attackers. There was a silence at first as they realized what was happening. Then a group of around 30 men rushed the thug. Hewitt was screaming, promising that every single one of them would die for this, and that their families would be wiped out and raped by his men. Just then, one of the other prisoners thrust the knife under his chin upwards, jamming the tongue into the roof of his mouth. He was screaming in a muted fashion, whilst punches and kicks hammered into him. And then the thug was unconscious, yet the blows kept raining in, some stamping on his head. Others just punched and punched into what they then thought was his dead body. Once they had finished, they left him lying in a pool of blood, and 5 hours later, they were all asleep when Hewitt awoke and slowly drew the knife from his head. He knew that once he did that, he could easily bleed to death. Then he tried to use the knife to remove the manacle attached to his left hand, without success. So instead, he started sawing into his own left arm, cutting his own hand off. He had worked in the butchery trade, so he just knew how to slice through that skin, sinew and bone. As the hand fell off onto the mud-covered floor, the manacle fell off too. Hewitt was free. Silently, this bruised and broken animal slid towards his enemy, stabbing each one in the eye, then rotating the knife inside their head to scramble their brains. He'd managed to kill half a dozen of his enemies as the blood poured from his bleeding stump and from the gaping wound in his neck. Finally, as he was beginning to feel dizzy, he just stabbed as many as he could as he felt the life leaving him. He dragged himself to the bars and called the guard. The guard had been sleeping and was annoyed, but had to take a look. When he did, he saw Hewitt's dead body against the bars. And there was his knife lying a foot inside the cell. He would have to get that out of there. So he reached inside And just at that moment, Hewitt grabbed his arm and pulled his face tight to the bars, slamming it. Then he let go of the man, grabbing the knife and slamming it into his face over and over and over again until the guard's body slumped into a heap. Hewitt managed to crawl out of the cell and even locked the door behind him. And then, as he tried to leave, the loss of blood caused him to dead faint on top of a fire, setting him alight. The following day was declared that an attempted breakout had occurred, where one brave guard was killed. William Hewitt and 7 other prisoners were killed, while others were seriously injured. Now, the prison never really got over this, and within a few years it was closed down. However, Hewitt was from an area on the suburbs of Newcastle city centre known as Arthur's Hill, and in several streets, particularly one called Blenkinsop Road, there have been regularly sightings ever since his death. In the cemetery at the Big Lamp, there are regular sightings of a man with one hand and a bloody stump. Dave Ward lived in that area in the 1960s, and he said, I would regularly see this huge figure of a bloke first thing in the morning. As I got up, he'd be in my living room. I could clearly see him through the glass, and then one day I had a girlfriend over to stay. Well, she got up before me, and she started screaming. She'd opened the door and seen this bloke. She told me that he was huge and fat, but only had one hand and a bloody stump. As she screamed, this big fella went for her, knocked her over. She hit the sofa and it went over too. Went to the church, had the place blessed and exorcised because the blessing actually made it worse. Worst thing about it was he made a noise like a pig, kind of wheezing and snorting. And while I tried to get some sleep, you could clearly hear it. Still, it's gone now, but I'll never forget that. That noise was unique. It's the closest I've ever come to being with a real ghost. Early in 1999, Catherine Clark lived there, rented a flat, a building that had been empty for some time, and within a single night she discovered why. She was in bed just as the sun was beginning to rise, and as she opened her eyes, she saw a man with blood all over his face and his mouth tightly closed, staring at him. This is how she explained it. He held out his arm, and it was a stump. I could clearly see veins, arteries, and bone where it had been hacked off. I started to scream, and he tried to kiss me. I remember tasting the iron in the blood as I tried to fight him off. I managed to push his heavy weight off me and was standing with my back against the wall, and he ran at me again, and as his heavy body hit me, I banged my head off the wall and I felt really woozy. He tried to pull my nightdress off me, and I was screaming so loudly that my neighbour kicked in my front door and ran in. My neighbour, whose wife claimed to be a medium, and she told me that it was just Bloody Billy, and that she had seen him a dozen times because we live in his part of town. So can you capture an entity that vicious? It seems you can. In 2003, as part of a world record-breaking ghost hunt, we placed 2 people in the flat that Catherine Clark had lived in. They were keen ghost hunters, and they brought with them an old-fashioned tape recorder and a dictaphone, and they set each one up in a different room. During the night, nothing happened. However, on getting home and checking the dictaphone, they found an amazing series of sounds. Perhaps the sound of the ghosts of the murderer and gang leader, William Hewitt, who by that time had been dead 300 years. And this is the sound they got.